The wind moves across the frozen plain like something alive. It carries no sound but its own voice, a low, relentless moan that presses against the wooden walls of a small structure half buried in snow. Inside, the darkness is nearly complete. A faint glow pulses from a bed of embers, barely visible beneath a layer of ash. The air is thick, heavy with the smell of smoke and animal fat and human bodies. It is 30 degrees below freezing outside. The people within this space will survive the night. They will survive the week. They will survive the entire winter. And they will do so not through luck, not through some imagined peasant hardiness, but through a system of survival so precisely engineered that most modern humans would fail to replicate it even with instruction. This is not a story of endurance. This is a story of intelligence. We begin with a correction. The image most people carry in their minds when they think of medieval peasants facing winter is fundamentally wrong. We imagine suffering. We imagine ignorance. We imagine people huddled around roaring fires, shivering, waiting for spring, surviving only because they were somehow tougher than we are today. This image is not just incomplete, it is inverted. The medieval peasant household facing a northern European winter was not a sight of passive endurance. It was a thermal machine. Every element of its construction, every behavior of its inhabitants, every object within its walls served a calculated function in the preservation of heat and life. To understand how people survived in wooden huts when temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius and below, we must first abandon the assumption that they were primitive. They were not. They were operating within constraints we can barely imagine, and they solved problems we have forgotten how to see. Consider what the cold actually means at this temperature. Exposed skin begins to suffer frostbite within minutes. Breath freezes in the air. Water left in a container overnight becomes solid. The human body, stripped of external support, begins to lose core temperature almost immediately when activity stops. Hypothermia can set in within an hour of exposure. Death follows. A modern person transported into a medieval winter landscape, dressed in contemporary clothing, placed inside what appears to be a crude wooden shelter, would likely not survive a single night without intervention. The structure would seem inadequate. The fire would seem too small. The cold would feel absolute, penetrating, fatal. And yet, generation after generation, millions of people lived through these winters. Children were born in January. Old men and women died of age, not cold. The question is not whether they survived. The question is how survival was even possible. The first instinct of the modern mind is to reach for fire. Fire is warmth. Fire is light. Fire is the universal human answer to cold. Surely, the peasants simply kept their fires burning through the night, fed by endless supplies of wood, and huddled close to the flames. This explanation collapses under the slightest scrutiny. Fire, in a medieval peasant dwelling, was not a savior. It was a problem to be managed. The structures in question were small, often no more than 4 or 5 meters in length, with ceilings so low that a tall person could not stand fully upright in many areas. Ventilation was minimal by design. A large roaring fire in such a space would have consumed the available oxygen within hours. The smoke, with no chimney as we understand the term, would have filled the interior, making breathing difficult, damaging lungs, stinging eyes. The fire risk was constant and catastrophic. Thatch roofs, dry timber walls, straw bedding, one spark, one gust of wind, and the entire structure becomes an inferno. Archaeological evidence from sites across northern and eastern Europe consistently shows that hearths in peasant dwellings were small, often little more than a meter in diameter, lined with stones or clay, positioned centrally or slightly off-center. The fires built within them were not bonfires. They were carefully controlled, low-burning sources of radiant heat, often banked with ash overnight to preserve embers without producing open flame. The goal was not maximum heat output. The goal was sustainable warmth over hours and days without killing the inhabitants through smoke inhalation or burning the house to the ground. Fuel itself was a constraint few modern people appreciate. Forests in medieval Europe were not open resources. They were owned, managed, divided. Peasants had rights to gather fallen wood, to collect deadfall, sometimes to cut specific trees under specific conditions. But they did not have unlimited access to timber. A winter's worth of fuel had to be gathered, dried, stored, and rationed. Burning wood continuously through a 5-month winter would have required quantities that many households simply could not secure. The fire was not the primary source of warmth. It was a supplement to systems already in place. The house itself was the primary technology. Archaeological excavations of peasant dwellings from the early medieval period through the High Middle Ages reveal construction principles that are invisible to the untrained eye but unmistakable once understood. In Scandinavia, in the British Isles, in the Alpine regions, in the forests of Eastern Europe, a consistent pattern emerges. Floors were sunken, walls were thick, roofs were steeply pitched, and the structures were integrated into the earth in ways that modern buildings deliberately avoid. Sunken floors, often half a meter below ground level, sometimes more, placed the living space within the thermal mass of the earth itself. Below the frost line, ground temperature remains relatively stable throughout the year, typically between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius, depending on the region. This is dramatically warmer than the air above during a severe winter. By digging the floor down, builders placed the inhabitants within a zone of natural insulation. The walls, constructed of timber, were often double-layered or packed with earth, clay, moss, or straw. These materials are poor conductors of heat, meaning they resist the transfer of thermal energy from the warm interior to the cold exterior. The thickness was not a sign of crude construction. It was deliberate thermal engineering. Roofs were pitched steeply not for aesthetic reasons but to manage snow. A thick layer of snow on a low-pitched roof adds insulating value. But too much snow causes collapse. The pitch was calibrated to allow some accumulation while shedding excess. Beneath the thatch or turf, smoke from the interior fire would rise and fill the upper space, coating the underside of the roof with soot and tar. This layer, built up over years, added water resistance and further insulation. The smoke itself, hovering in the upper portion of the interior, created a thermal barrier between the heated air below and the cold roof above. Inhabitants lived beneath this layer in a stratum of warmer, cleaner air. The system was not accidental, it was refined over centuries. What modern observers often mistake for discomfort was in fact optimization. The low ceilings reduced the volume of air that needed to be heated. The small windows, or often the complete absence of windows, eliminated points of heat loss. The single entrance was typically positioned on the side, sheltered from prevailing winds, and was often protected by a small antechamber or vestibule that served as an airlock, preventing direct gusts from entering the living space. Every feature of the peasant hut that appears crude to modern eyes served a thermal function. These were not failed attempts at building comfortable houses. They were successful attempts at building survivable ones. Clothing extended this architecture onto the body itself. Wool was the dominant material, and its properties were understood with a sophistication that modern synthetic fabric engineers have only recently matched. Wool fibers are crimped, creating tiny air pockets that trap body heat. Wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture before it begins to feel wet, and it continues to insulate even when damp. This is critical. In a medieval winter, contact with snow, breath condensation, and perspiration from labor made absolute dryness impossible. A material that lost its insulating value when wet would have been useless. Wool retained warmth under conditions that would render cotton or linen deadly. Linen, in contrast, was worn against the skin precisely because it wickeded moisture away from the body, transferring it to the outer wool layers where it could evaporate or freeze without drawing heat from the core. The layering was deliberate. Linen undergarments, wool tunics, wool cloaks, wool hoods, wool leggings. Each layer added insulation. Each layer served a distinct function. Furs, where available, provided additional protection, particularly for extremities. Mittens, not gloves, preserved hand heat by keeping fingers together. Hoods covered not just the head but the neck, the most vulnerable point for heat loss after the head itself. Clothing was not fashion, it was survival equipment, and it was worn continuously, day and night, indoors and out. But even architecture and clothing were insufficient without heat sources beyond fire. The most significant of these was biological. Peasant households in winter were not collections of individuals. They were thermal units. Families slept together, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes servants or laborers in shared beds or on shared platforms. Body heat accumulates. 2 bodies generate more warmth than 1. 5 bodies generate more than 2. In the enclosed, insulated space of a properly constructed hut, the combined metabolic output of a family could raise the interior temperature several degrees above what the structure alone would maintain. Privacy, as modern people understand it, did not exist in these conditions. It was not sacrificed reluctantly. It was never expected. Sleeping arrangements were organized around thermal efficiency. The youngest and oldest, the most vulnerable to cold, were placed in the center, surrounded by warmer bodies. The able-bodied adults took the outer positions, absorbing the colder air from the walls and edges. Animals extended this logic further. In many regions, livestock were housed within the same structure as the human inhabitants, separated by a low partition or sometimes by no barrier at all. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, these animals generate substantial body heat. A single cow produces metabolic heat equivalent to a small space heater running continuously. In a household with several animals, the thermal contribution was significant. The arrangement also protected the animals from freezing, preserved the household's most valuable economic assets, and allowed for constant monitoring of pregnant or sick animals. The smell, the noise, the lack of separation, these are features that modern sensibilities recoil from. To the medieval peasant, they were the difference between a survivable winter and a fatal one. Food was not merely sustenance, it was fuel. Winter diets in medieval Northern Europe were calorie-dense by necessity. Fat, in particular, was essential. Salted pork, lard, butter, cheese, these were not luxuries. They were metabolic necessities. The body generates heat through the digestion and metabolism of food, a process called thermogenesis. Fats produce more heat per gram than carbohydrates or proteins. A diet rich in animal fats provided the raw material for internal heat production. Porridges, thick and heavy, made from oats or barley, often cooked with animal fat or milk, provided sustained energy release. Bread, dense and coarse, required significant digestive effort and kept the metabolism active. Fermented foods, sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, fermented dairy provided nutrients that would otherwise be unavailable in winter and supported gut health in conditions where fresh food was non-existent. Meals were timed not for convenience but for thermal strategy. Eating before sleep raised body temperature during the vulnerable hours of the night. The body itself became a furnace, fed by food and insulated by clothing and bodies and walls. And yet, survival was not only physical. The psychological dimension of medieval winter survival is perhaps the least understood and the most essential. Consider the conditions. Darkness fell in the late afternoon and did not lift until mid-morning. The hours of light were few, and even those were often gray, filtered through cloud and snow. Inside the hut, the darkness was near total, except for the faint glow of the hearth. There was no electric light. There were no books for most people. There was no entertainment as we conceive it. There was cold and darkness and confinement and the same faces, the same walls, the same routine for months on end. The psychological pressure of this existence was immense. Yet communities did not collapse into despair. They developed systems of mental survival as sophisticated as their physical ones. Storytelling was not a pastime. It was a technology. The long evenings were filled with tales, mythological, religious, historical, personal. These narratives structured time, provided shared experience, reinforced community identity, and offered mental escape from physical confinement. Songs served similar functions, as did riddles, games, and the recitation of genealogies and lineages. Ritual marked the passage of time when the sun could not. Feast days, saints' days, the turning of the year, these were not merely religious observances. They were psychological anchors, breaking the endless gray sameness of winter into manageable segments. Routine itself was a survival tool. The daily tasks of survival, feeding animals, maintaining the fire, preparing food, mending clothing, provided structure and purpose. Idleness was dangerous not because of moral failure but because of psychological collapse. Work kept the mind occupied. Work kept the body warm. Work kept despair at a distance. We return now to where we began, to the hut, to the cold, to the question: how did medieval peasants survive in wooden huts in -20-degree weather? The answer is not a single technique. It is not fire. It is not wool. It is not fat. It is not animals. It is not architecture. It is all of these, integrated into a system so complete, so interdependent, that removing any single element would have caused the whole to fail. The medieval peasant household in winter was not a collection of desperate improvisations. It was a thermal ecosystem, refined over generations, adapted to local conditions, optimized within the constraints of available materials and technologies. The hut was not a primitive failure compared to modern housing. It was a different solution to a different problem. Modern houses are designed for comfort, for space, for light, for privacy, for connection to external energy sources. Medieval huts were designed for survival, with no external energy except wood that had to be gathered by hand and food that had to be grown and stored in a world without refrigeration. Within those constraints, the solutions were not merely adequate, they were brilliant. The peasants who lived through those winters were not tougher than modern people. They were not genetically superior. They were not more willing to suffer. They were beneficiaries of accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations, encoded in architecture and clothing and diet and social structure. They survived because their ancestors had learned how to survive and had transmitted that learning faithfully. They survived because they did not fight the cold. They managed it. They worked with their environment, not against it. They understood that warmth is not created, it is retained. And they built their entire lives around that understanding. When we look at the remains of their houses, excavated from frozen soil, we are not looking at the shelters of ignorant victims. We are looking at the engineering of people who understood their world with a clarity that industrialization has erased from modern consciousness. The sunken floors, the thick walls, the absent windows, the low ceilings, the central hearth, these are not signs of poverty. They are signs of intelligence, applied under constraint. The smoke-blackened rafters, the soot-coated thatch, the animal pens within the living space, these are not failures of civilization. They are solutions to the problem of surviving without fossil fuels, without insulation foam, without central heating, without any of the technologies we consider essential to life. The medieval peasant did not endure winter. The medieval peasant solved winter. And in that solution, we find not a story of suffering to be pitied, but a record of adaptation to be studied. The cold has not changed. Human ingenuity has. But the lessons remain, buried in the earth, waiting to be understood. The huts are gone, the people are gone, but the knowledge persists, if we have the patience to recover it. Outside the walls, the wind still blows, the snow still falls, the temperature still drops, and the silence of the winter night stretches on, as it has for 10,000 years, indifferent to the small points of warmth that flicker and hold against the dark.